Hi, this is Roger Hallam, and you're listening to Designing the Revolution. This is Talk 3, Part 2, the wider context. Okay, so in the last session I was expanding on our understanding of the killer facts and the raw situation, as you might say. We talked about the extremities situation, tipping points, delayed effects, and then I went on to the sort of broader, often ignored situation of the conservatism of the communication of this information by our scientists, scientific establishments, the media, and what have you. So we talked about the issue particularly about certainty, and in this talk I'm sort of continuing on really. I'm going to be talking about compounding, which is another thing which doesn't sound that important, but then the more you think about it, the more it's a bit of a bombshell sort of realization about how all this stuff works. So I'm going to talk about that. Then I'm going to take a little bit of a detour. I'm going to be talking about what I call hard stops, or at least critical points. So I'm going to go through some stats to give you a flavour of what's going to happen when and how bad it will be. And then finally, dare I say, I'm going to talk about extinction, which is often left off in discussions about this situation, but needs to be talked about for a number of obvious reasons, really. All right, so after that, we're going to go on to the inevitable revolution and the social and political inevitabilities that come out of these realities that I'm going to talk about. All right, so let's get going on compounding. So I'm going to give, it's quite a difficult thing to explain, so I'm just going to explain it as I usually do, really, through a number of examples. So the first one is about the Rhine, or about Germany. So the Rhine is, I think, the biggest river in Germany, coming out on the North Sea, and you may know that I think it was this summer, it almost dried up, and I read a newspaper article and it said, so this is, a big problem because ironically there's these big tugs or whatever, or boats, and they take coal down, and they couldn't take coal down the river because it was so shallow, so they were only taking 25-50%, and then they had to take it by road, so obviously all the costs went up, and these had knock-on effects and what have you. Anyway, in this article, they said, and this is going to result in a 0.2 decline in the gross national product. It's going to take off rather a fifth of a percent of gross national product in Germany this year. So when you read this, of course, like when you read most stuff about the crisis in the media, you get this little snapshot of a particular little bit of the situation, and obviously the cognitive reaction to this is, oh, well, it's really bad, but it's just another bad thing. Now, there's a number of problems with this. First of all, obviously, as we've discovered, as you might say, the situation is getting worse. So the Rhine is, for the sake of argument, going to be, going to become really shallow due to drought, arguably every year on average from 2030. Now, I'm not saying that's absolutely certain, but it's certainly a viable probability. And obviously, it's not going to be every year. Some years it's going to be fine, and other years it might completely dry up like the Rhone River did in France this year. So I'm going to suggest that each year in the 2030s, there's going to be a reduction in the gross national product, or a minus on the gross national product of 0.2, a fifth of a percent. And you might think, Yeah, that's pretty reasonable probability. But this is the critical point, right? If the climate crisis, if you want to call it that, is happening to the extent that the river is in trouble every year, then inevitably, I don't think that's too strong a word, lots of other things are going to be happening as well. So, for instance, there's likely to be a climate-related war or a war that's created by secondary effects. So let's say, something similar to Ukraine is happening each year on average again during the 2030s, and that adds another 0.2 reduction in gross national product. Now, as we also talked about, it's close to inevitable there's going to be major refugee crises due to the secondary effects of extreme weather, and let's say that produces another 0.2 decline, then there's likely to be disease, maybe another COVID, knocking off another 0.2%. Then there's forest dieback, that's beginning to be a massive problem in Germany. It could be fires, could be disease. So let's say that creates a minus 0.2, and then there's floods. Those are major floods in Germany this year. So again, on average, some years there won't be floods, but other years there's going to be these massive floods. That takes off 0.2. So I've just chosen 5 things there, and you add them all together, and that's minus 1% of gross national product. So if you times that by 10, because it's every year in the 2030s, then that's minus 10%. So the gross national product, we're saying, is a viable and arguably inevitable probability that in the 2030s, Germany, due to this compounding effect, these interconnected effects of weather chaos due to putting carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, so you might say, yeah, that's really, really bad, but obviously Germany doesn't exist in some bubble. It's part of this massively interconnected global economy, and similar effects will be happening to every other country in the world, because, as we've established, it's universal. It's not like, South America is going to be let off or something, or nothing's going to be happening in the United States. Obviously, some countries, due to sort of random factors, will be affected more than others. But for the sake of argument, this is going to be happening on average to every country in the world. So if every country is experiencing a minus 10% reduction in gross national product, then it goes without saying that this will have a compounding effect. In other words, there's going to be, for instance, loss of export markets, more expensive imports, economic nationalism, protectionism, and such like. So we can say that the compounding effect of that will be maybe another minus 10% of in gross national product. So that's minus 20%. Now the point here isn't that it's going to be minus 20%. That's not what I'm trying to say. I mean, it could be minus 40, it could be minus 5. The point I'm trying to make is that if we're going to do an accurate analysis, i.e. what's most likely to happen as opposed to what's certain, and we discussed that, right? What's most likely to happen is there's going to be 10 to 20% reduction in gross national product. What we're certain of is, maybe there's going to be a few little tricky things around the edges. And of course, the reasonable worst case scenario is massively worse than this. So let's take another rather embarrassing example of not very clear thinking. So let's look at Florida. So as you probably know, Miami, a big city. If you know your sort of climate science situation, you know that it's going to be flooded, absolutely inevitably. And so the idea is, let's say, that they're going to build a wall around it. Now, just for the record, apparently this is impossible because it's limestone, so all the water goes underneath. But let's, forget about that little empirical problem. and assume you can build a wall. So let's say the wall is going to be $2 billion. I've got no idea whether that's about right, but again, the numbers aren't that important. So they do a report. Miami Council say, right, we're going to build a wall, and we're going to need to build a wall, say, in 10 years' time, and we need to know how much it's going to cost. So what people do is they'll go out and they'll work out, labour costs, material costs, overhead costs, blah blah blah, and they come up with $2 billion. Now, why is that almost certainly total nonsense? Because if and when, or rather when, we get to the point in, say, the 2030s where Miami has to be evacuated, otherwise they are going to, unless they build a wall, then again, like the Rhine River, 101 other things are going to be happening at the same time. So you'll probably start to see a pattern here in these examples. So, for instance, we know at 2 degrees centigrade there will be 1,000 million refugees. So let's say, for the sake of argument, there's going to be 100 million refugees coming out of Central America. Some of them may be going, heading south. Some of them will be heading north. So there's going to be a massive amount of chaos and financial overhead of dealing with these immigrants. That's going to have knock-on effects of security, law and order, ability to create effective transportation. Then, obviously, it's not like Miami exists in some little sealed world. Everywhere else along the American coast is going to be suffering and having to build walls, and the knock-on effects of flooding, and then we've got hurricanes and extreme heat events and all the rest of it, which is going to create an enormous fiscal cost to the federal government. It's going to, in other words, start to run out of money. And then lastly, of course, everyone else is going to want to build walls as well. So there's going to be massive demand for materials, and the materials are going to be in short supply. So obviously they're going to cost a lot more money. You're going to have to ship them in. And that's, as I said, there's going to be transportation, security problems, and such like. So the idea of doing an assessment of the cost of the materials at today's prices with today's migrant situation, security situation, fiscal situation is ridiculously naive. So for the sake of argument, we might say, well, it's not going to be $2 billion, it's going to be $10 billion. And then, of course, that's naive as well, because it's very likely that if it goes over $5 billion, it simply isn't going to be paid for, or even more likely, arguably, it's going to get half done, and then it won't get completed, because everyone will have to start moving out of Florida because of the knock-on effects of the collapsing wheel trade and such like. Okay, so last small example, I think you probably got the idea here, is insulation. So I helped initiate the Insulate Britain campaign in the UK. I came up with this idea of insulation would be great because it's the biggest no-brainer thing that in the UK that you should be doing to reduce carbon emissions. No one was talking about it. And to be honest with you, I didn't really know much. It's not really my subject. I do mobilisation and what have you. That's my specialism. But through the process of doing this campaign, I was talking to a bunch of, experts in insulation. And just as a little rule of thumb, it's always good to actually speak to professionals on the front line, the guys that do the essential work, rather than people who have got particular sort of interests in making things sound reasonable. So the guy that I found most interesting was this 50, 60-year-old guy. Spent his 40 years in the building trade. He was an advisor to cities in North England, Leeds and Sheffield. He was a proper regular guy, had a moustache, beer belly. He was the real thing. And he came on a call, and he was brutally honest, because these guys generally are, because there are PR departments behind them. And he said, look, the situation is if you want to insulate, I think it's 29 million homes in the UK, be really difficult, he said, words to the effect. And then he said, first of all, it's going to cost £600 billion. That's a massive amount of money. I think it was on the news the other day, the government's spending £1 billion, insulating view houses. This is an enormous infrastructural project. Secondly, he said, builders don't want to do it. The people in the building industry do not want to do this because they've always been let down by the government. There's no trust with the government. They don't want to take people on and all sorts of risk factors. Secondly, of course, there aren't enough builders anyway because this is a massive job. So you're going to have to take 500,000, 1 million people out of other forms of work to get this job done, because it's got to be done in the next 10 years, to reduce carbon emissions and all that business. Then he said, well, there's no people to train them, the training colleges aren't there, all that infrastructure doesn't exist. Then, of course, like previous two examples, he was saying there aren't the materials, right? I mean, materials to insulate 29 million houses, they just aren't around. You're going to have to import them. And as with the Florida example, that means, everyone else is going to want these materials and they're going to cost much more money. And then, you've got all sorts of transportation problems and such like. So the idea that it's going to cost $600 billion, of course, is pretty naive because it assumes all these things, you can just go down and get these materials off the shelf. So there's no contextual analysis of it. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to go on to, after this, now we've done compounding, is what I personally call hard stops or critical points. What I mean by that is there's a number of stats which are really critical, which give you the ability to understand when things are going to start cracking up. So I've spent a bit of time talking about how this works. Then you have to put the numbers in. So I'm going to put some numbers in here to give an idea that the 2030s are going to be the critical tipping point in terms of a collapse event. And the reason we can be fairly certain about that is because we have some really certain numbers. Now I'm going to give a little selection here. I think if if I had my 200 pages of notes from various scientists, I could probably come up with 20 or 30 of them. The general rule of thumb, just as a little aside, is that if you read articles in the Guardian or in science magazines, there's usually a killer stat. It's usually in the middle of the article. Usually they give some general concerns. Then they'll give you the actual stat, and then they go on to, what they think policymakers should do about it. And it's that stat that's important. You can collect them and you put them all together, a bit like a detective, and can work out how they're going to compound together, and then you can make a pretty clear prediction of when things are going to happen. So one of the problems is, smart people know, is predictions arguably are really problematic. But that's not necessarily the case. So, for instance, trying to predict a stock market crash, for instance, is actually quite difficult. However, just before it happens to be not that difficult at all. So you may remember, if you've seen The Big Short, people are saying, there's going to be a crash, in 2008. And there's this guy who's going, well, maybe not. And then he goes down to Florida, I think it's Florida, and there's people who are really poor there, and they've got mortgages on 5 houses or whatever, and they're about to get sick. Then everyone knows they're not going to be able to pay their mortgage payments, in about a month. And there's a bit where this guy goes, this is definitely going to happen. In other words, he's got out of the office and the generalities of it, and he's actually found out this is definitely 100% going to happen. And you can put a number on it, in the next month or two, and then he speeds back to New York to make lots of money from it. So this is like getting out and talking to, sex workers in Florida, I think it was, this next 10 minutes. So here we go. Let's get out and check out Lake Mead. So Lake Mead is, I think, the biggest dam in southwest United States. So it's losing water. Last year it lost 40 inches, or this year, the upshot of it is it's got 41 inches left, presumably less now. In other words, at some point in the next 12 months, give or take a bit of variability, it's going to run out of water. And that's going to have a cascading effect on the whole water supply of the southwest of the United States. Tens of millions of people, a massive amount of industry, and obviously the other lakes, it's just a matter of time before they run out of water as well. And obviously, they might be able to mitigate to a certain extent. But the fundamental hard stop here is there's no water. And again, as a little aside, this is not a money issue. If there's no water, there's no water. It's not there anymore. A bit like when there's no food, there's no food. It doesn't matter how much money you've got. I mean, again, you could truck this stuff in or do desalination plants, but all these things take time, enormous amount of money, and such like. So we can say with some predictability in the next 2 years, let's say 5 years for the sake of conservatism, the economy of the southwest of the United States is going to crash because of lack of water, i.e. having no water. So similarly, if we look at Australia, so there's a peer-reviewed paper. Notice this is not, someone's, prediction down the road. A peer-reviewed paper after the forest fires 2 years ago. The paper said we can expect such fires, which burnt down 20% of the forest in Australia, affected the health of 80% of the population, went on for weeks and weeks. We can expect such a fire to be happening each year on average within 20 years. 2040. And 2060 is going to be a cool summer. It's going to have fires like that. Well, obviously, when we say average, that means, some years it'll be 10%, other years it could be 40%. What we can say then is within 20 years, then Sydney is going to have to be evacuated. Partially because of the health effects of months of smoke coming over the city, and obviously because of all the secondary effects on the economy and psychological contagion of depression and despondency and what have you. So incidentally, I told a bunch of climate activists in Australia this, and they all look really shocked. And of course, this is because of the these denial mechanisms. But the fact of the matter is, if it wasn't such an emotive subject, everyone would look at that data and say, yeah, well, obviously Sydney is going to have to be evacuated. So similarly in California, leaving aside the Lake Mead situation, I think I haven't got completely clear on the stats here, but I think 3-4 years ago, 1% of California burned down, and everyone thought that was terrible. The highest burn rate ever in California's history, and then 2 years later, 2% of California burned down. So again, if you get, you can probably put a few more data points in there, but this is an exponential situation. Obviously, if it gets hotter, it doesn't just get hotter. The burn rate of forests doesn't move in a linear fashion. It gets hotter and hotter. Then the degree to which a forest burns goes up exponentially. So, as you may know, it was 49 degrees in a town in British Columbia, and then surprise, 3 days later, the whole town burnt down because all the wood burst into flames. So we can say with some broad degree of accuracy that in 10 years' time, 10 to 20%, maybe a lot more of California will be burning down on an average year. So again, we can say Los Angeles will be evacuated within 10 years with some degree of certainty. So let's go over to Russia. So again, as I said, the people to listen to when you want to get these stats are for people on the front line, people that do insulation in North England, people that in trade magazines in Russia, so Siberia Times, I think this came from. I think this is right, 30% of the properties, housing stock in the Arctic Circle are starting to subside. And then it has this remarkable statistic that by 2050, 30% of the gross national product in Russia will have to be spent on responding to the subsidence of presumably millions of buildings, not just in the Arctic Circle, but all around Russia. And this is because the permafrost is melting because it's getting hotter. Again, if you looked at this dispassionately, yeah, it's pretty obvious. It's happening. It's pretty obvious it's going to increase exponentially. The point is, of course, is that if Russia's spending 30% of its gross national product on subsidence, it's also going to be spending an awful lot of its money on security issues because of social breakdown, mass migration from the Middle East, wars, all the rest of it. So all these things are going to compound. So you can say that with some degree of accuracy that the viability of the Russian state will not exist after 2040. Maybe before, of course, but certainly by 2050, that government is not going to exist in any modern sense. So, speeding on along, we've got India. A number of predictions say India, along with Pakistan and Bangladesh, are the most vulnerable countries, partially because of their massive population. In India, with the increases in temperatures, you're looking at a 30% reduction in wheat. They decided not to export any wheat this year, as you may know, because of very high temperatures. So we can say by 2030 will be mass starvation in India due to this collapse in the ability to grow wheat, and obviously the secondary and compounding effects of that. In China, I don't have the specific stats on it from what I remember, but I think some point around the mid-century, people aren't going to be able to work outside due to the wet bulb effect. Well, if you can't work outside, then obviously you can't sustain agriculture, so that's going to lead to mass starvation and the viability of the Chinese state, along with India and Russia, is probably going to collapse at some point in the 2040s. Sir David King, just to stay in Asia, says Vietnam will probably face 99%, I think he said, but let's say for the sake of argument, 90% of Vietnam being underwater with high tides and rising sea levels. So a massive amount of rice production will become unviable. I don't have a date on that, but it gives some clarity that in the context of compounding effects and secondary effects, the global economy and global society will collapse at some point in the 2030s, and certainly in the 2040s. So just, this cheery note, as you might say, let's just have a look at probably the most important sort of structural element here, which is the extra loops of hot and cold weather, or dry and wet weather that cross the northern hemisphere. So, as I think I've explained in the previous talks, but if I haven't, as the temperature increases in the Arctic, the temperature differential between the equator and the Arctic becomes less, and so the energy pushing the wind patterns around the northern hemisphere slow down. So that means you get more drifting of cold weather further south and more drifting of hot weather further north. So you've got these big loops. And then second thing is that obviously if the winds aren't so forceful, then the weather patterns slow down. So instead of it just raining over the British Isles for 4 or 5 days, which is what it used to do when I was growing up, you get these big patches of 4 or 5 weeks or 2 or 3 months of rain or extreme heat or extreme cold weather. So, a little example is, I think it was the warmest November on record or thereabouts last month in the UK. And then just beginning of December, we have like -7, I think it was last night. I'm sitting here in my cell with developing hypothermia, I'm not exaggerating, through the windows not being able to shut until yesterday when this guy came in with the big pliers and closed my window for me. So, yeah, this is what you call critical points. Okay. So, just to get this over and done with, we're going to talk about extinction. So extinction is a bit of an interesting sort of emotional entity, as you might say. It's quite interesting. No one used to talk about extinction before Extinction Rebellion came along. One of the reasons we called it Extinction Rebellion was to break these two taboos, that actually what we're talking about is extinction, i.e. the death of all the people who belong to the human race, all of the human race, and obviously the necessity for rebellion, which is what we'll come and talk about. Now, before Extinction Rebellion came along, of course, people didn't talk about rebellion and didn't talk about extinction, and they've largely stopped talking about extinction again in any meaningful sense. It's a bit of a blip. But let's talk about extinction. So just to be clear, what extinction means once we've sort of have more high resolution sort of look at it is when the death rate is over the birth rate. So in other words, a species or, a community of human beings disappears when more people are dying than more people are born. That's pretty obvious basic maths. So what we're looking at here, often people think extinction is a bit of a, science fiction-y thing. One day everyone exists and next day no one exists, and they say, well, that's ridiculous. But once you understand that the death rate being higher than the birth rate, then it's pretty easy, in fact, for extinction events to happen. So when I was, a teenager, people used to talk about the nuclear winter, which terrified my generation when we were in our teens, and that was here today, gone tomorrow, like the nuclear winter would effectively destroy every human being within, a week or two. However, with climate, with putting carbon into the atmosphere to the extent that we are looking inevitably at a slow extinction event as far as we can see. So what does this look like? Okay, so I'm going to mention three situations that take us over into absolute extinction, or maybe we can call it effective extinction. I think my understanding of effective extinction means that the number of people that exist is so low that it can't maintain itself. So this is like something from ecology, the study of ecology, that a species falls to such low numbers that although it still exists, it inevitably is going to die because it can't maintain itself. Okay, so let's look first of all at the nuclear situation. Now, I confess I'm not 100% sure of this because, like a lot of these things, not many people talk about them. But from my understanding, from talking to a bunch of people, there's 200 plus nuclear power stations around the world. I think all in all, at least most of them are on the coast. Obviously, there's going to be sea level rise, high tides. There's going to be breakdown of law and order. There's going to be, lack of people able to run these things. They're highly dangerous. They need massively trained staff. They need a massive amount of money. But the critical extinction fact, as it were, is that if you decide to close them down, which arguably or almost certainly you're going to have to do as sea level rises, it takes 50 or so years to actually close these things down. So the other thing is, if you don't close them down properly and they overheat, then they churn out massive amounts of radiation. So the proposition, of course, is that this is not going to be some nice, neat, social collapse situation. Social collapse by definition involves a massive amount of chaos, lack of money and all the rest of it. So it's highly probable that some of these nuclear power stations won't be closed down because there won't be the money, resources or know-how to keep them from overheating. And this explosion, like Chernobyl and such like, will churn out all this radiation, and as we all know, this kills human beings very rapidly, and it travels all around the world. So that's scenario number one. Obviously, these scenarios can compound and interconnect with each other. Scenario number two is methane. So Sir David King, the former chief scientific advisor to the British government, said just 2 or 3 months ago that what we're looking at is methane coming out of the permafrost because it melts. Once that happens, as and when it happens, then temperatures will rise, quote, by 4 to 8 degrees centigrade in 20 years, in 2 decades. So this is a done deal, as you might say, that if the temperature rises by 4 to 8 degrees centigrade, then I think at 4 degrees centigrade, you've lost the habitability of half of the Earth's surface. So the speed of it and the extent of it, if we're honest with ourselves, that's it. We're going to head to billions of deaths and almost certainly effective extinction within a decade or two. So the next question is, how likely is this eventuality of methane coming out of the permafrost? Well, the first thing to say about this is not a maybe situation, it's a when situation, in so much as the temperatures are increasing, right? It's basic physics. Temperature gets hot. By definition, ice melts when it's hot. If ice melts in the permafrost, it releases gas, because the only reason that the gas isn't coming out is because it's blocked in by the ice. That's indisputable. If it was such a controversial thing, everyone would be saying when rather than if. So at the moment, we're at 1.2, 1.3. So to my mind, it seems pretty obvious this is going to happen at some point between 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, remembering, of course, you have to times that by 4 or maybe even 5 to get the temperature in the Arctic. And there's an interesting paper out, in case you don't know, which says that methane is actually going up exponentially. Its emission is going up exponentially. And the reason for this, at least on initial investigation in this paper, is not because of humans, it's because of the positive feedback loop between higher temperatures and methane escaping from various places, soils and permafrost around the world. In other words, we're on the cusp of this taking off regardless of what humans do, because it gets hotter in the Arctic, which melts more ice, which has more dark water, which raises temperatures, and off it goes like a ball down the hill, as I've spoken about in the previous talk. And a little aside, David King has got the bright idea that this could be stopped with various forms of geoengineering, of course, so it's not 100% certain, but it's there as a major candidate in causing human extinction. So the third one is what happens when the Arctic melts and the Antarctic melts as well, like has happened, 4 or 5 times, maybe more, in the Earth's history. So we know, again, with some sort of 100%, 99% precision now, because of lots of scholars have studied various sources of evidence, that when this happens, it becomes tropical weather in the Arctic, with tropical trees and alligators and all the rest of it. And what this means is that there's no wind, and that makes the currents in the ocean stop, and this basically creates stagnant seas, and this emits, I think it's hydrogen sulfide, which happens to be poisonous to mammals. And this is why in the great dyings of the previous mass extinction events wasn't because there wasn't any food necessarily, but it certainly was because of a change in the composition of the atmosphere. And incidentally, the oxygen levels, I think, declined by 25% to 12%, if I remember rightly. So by definition, any surviving human beings will die. Now, no one's quite sure when this would happen, whether it's, tens of years, hundreds of years, or thousands of years. The point is, of course, that it's more or less a done deal once you get past this tipping point towards hot house Earth. And in my view, anyway, probably the most important statistic on putting carbon into the atmosphere is the speed at which it's being put in. So again, according to scholarly sources, the human race is putting carbon into the atmosphere 8 to 30 times faster than at any point in the Earth's history, which is probably, as I say, the most important fact that you want to take in from these 3 or 4 talks. In other words, we're kicking that ball over the hill, down the cliff, 8 to 30 times faster than it's ever happened before. So all these things are speeding along 8 to 30 times faster than we thought they would. Okay, so I'm not, I could spend a lot more time on this, of course. I could spend a good 5 or 10 minutes talking about the oceans. The oceans potentially going to create human extinction. You've got the wild card of nuclear war, of course, and various other, variables which are a little bit more difficult to sort of pin down probabilities. But with these look like they're done deals, unless there's some dramatic innovation, which of course there could be in terms of human organisation and human innovation with science and technology. And I'll talk about that next on the next session in more detail. So the last 2 things to say, I suppose, is just to acknowledge there are enormous, and maybe the word infinite is appropriate here, infinite and enormous legal, moral and spiritual implications of us heading towards extinction. And it's reasonable to say that the main scenario, not the inevitable scenario, but the main scenario is the human race will go extinct due to these end domino points. So, for instance, if you're in court and you say, well, I'm involved in civil resistance because there's a substantive and arguably inevitable probability of human extinction, then from a sort of logical point of view, that justifies any form of disruption, logically speaking, from a legal point of view. Okay, so what we've done then is moved in these sessions from this low resolution, vague, reformist, issue-based, framing of climate change through to a higher resolution, what exactly happens when this physical process of putting carbon into the atmosphere goes ahead at 8 to 30 times higher level than at any point in the Earth's history. And you can see here that, assuming you're open enough to listen to it, that we can start with some precision understanding what's going to happen when, and that prepares us for the response. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next session, in my introductory talks, and that will be the inevitability of revolution. More about that in the next session. Thanks so much.